malice, treachery, deceit. Eyeshadow? Oh my god, that black cloak is amazing. You know, that shady character is actually making some pretty good points. Oh, I think I like the villain. I think the villain is my favorite character.
Hi, I'm Tawny Plattis, voice actor, comedian, and chronically online individual. Occasionally I'll host an AMA on some of my platforms, and a question that I often get is if I could provide the voiceover for any character in any movie or any TV show, which character would it be? And that's not really something I ever consider, because every established character has an established voice actor. And while I do enjoy impressions, it's not really a part of the job unless you're one of those lucky few who happens to get cast for celebrity voice matching. And when I explained that to someone recently, they went, okay, so then what kind of character would you want to play? And it didn't take long for me to give an answer, which in hindsight is only a little concerning. In this video today, I'm going to try to explain why, without a second thought, I responded, I want to be a villain. The narrative structure of any compelling story is dependent upon an antagonistic force. A story about a person who doesn't face any trial or adversity isn't really a story, it's more of a transcript.
For instance, something like Bob walked to the park. He had a lovely day. Isn't a story so much as it's a Facebook post that receives one like from your distant cousin in Connecticut. However, Bob walked to the park and he stepped in a puddle is the foundation for a story. Now we have an antagonistic force that has created a problem for Bob. If you've ever had one wet sock, you know this is a heinous offense on behalf of the puddle. Bob's damp foot isn't super compelling, and a puddle isn't a classically interesting antagonist. It doesn't have a motive and it doesn't inspire any deeper questions. But imagine if we change that sentence to something like this. Bob walked to the park, but on his way, he was mugged by a dangerous-looking man with a scar on the left side of his face. Now we're getting somewhere. Bob is a largely featureless protagonist, and that allows you to imprint on him and empathize with him. He doesn't have many defining features because you're meant to feel what he does. When he steps in a puddle, you imagine that you're the one with the soggy sock. It's annoying, but not exactly gripping. But when Bob is put in a situation with a dangerous-looking and unpredictable bad guy, when the antagonistic force is a person and is given some defining features, the narrative value of the story is increased. All Bob wanted to do was go to the park. But this new character, with the mysterious scar whose motives are only clear on the surface, who jumped out of the shadows and took control of the whole scene with his demands, he's the one propelling the narrative into something far more interesting. So even if this example is a bit basic, sometimes in a story, and especially early in a story, we can look at a villain and say, wow, I'm really into their whole deal. They have defining features. They seem fully fleshed out. They know what they want, and they're not afraid to go get it. Maybe I'm into this whole antagonist and their aesthetic.
Bob didn't do anything interesting or subversive. He didn't make any choices. Bob stepped in a puddle and his wallet was stolen. What he does with that information will define his character for us. But for now, he's powerless to stop the strange man with the scar on his face. To quote one of the greatest anti-heroes of all time, the difference between a villain and a supervillain is... presentation!
The hallmark of an iconic villain is the atmosphere with which they are presented, the way they carry themselves, and, let's be totally honest, the fashion. I mean, why be Sleeping Beauty when you can be Maleficent? For every Batman at a convention, there are 10 Jokers, and for every Joker, at least a dozen Harley Quinns, which is 120 Harley Quinns per Batman, and no Harley Quinns for me. In the latest iterations of movies that follow this villain-hero formula I laid out previously, mainstream entertainment companies such as Disney and Warner Brothers have shown they realize that people are incredibly interested in the exploits of a daring villain or anti-hero. Loki from the Avengers has his own show. Cruella de Vil got her own movie. And Harley Quinn has at least 3 franchises in the works at any given time. Not that I'm complaining. I really like Harley Quinn, okay? I'm basic. Let me have that. The life of an iconic villain is devilishly attractive in all the right ways, with every hip sway and evil whisper enough to send an entire generation of young adults hurtling into a bi panic. But there's one more thing, in my opinion, that can make a villain truly iconic. And that is their death. The death of the most iconic villains often comes at the hands of their vindictiveness and willingness to put themselves in harm's way to simply achieve their goals. Scar from The Lion King, Frollo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Clayton from Tarzan. Really, most Disney villains cause their own defeat because of their arrogant desire to have the final dramatic strike. The villain can't just stand by and watch their victory. The villain suffers defeat and ultimately saves the protagonist because they were so arrogant, so sinister, and so unmistakably evil that they just had to have the final blow. And it cost them everything. That is the kind of self-serving spite that makes a villain iconically terrifying. That and looking very, very good while being very, very bad. Animation has been around long before celluloid in the form of Paleolithic cave paintings, shadow play, magic lanterns, and flipbooks, just to name a few mediums. These were often simple scenes, and more complex stories with fleshed-out villains weren't brought to life until well into the 20th century, the most notable creator being Walt Disney. The Evil Queen from Snow White was the first character to ever speak in an animated feature film. Brought to life by Lucille Laverne, the incredibly talented actor provided the voice for both the Evil Queen and her alter ego, the Wicked Witch, achieving the dramatic vocal change by removing her false teeth when portraying the latter. The Evil Queen terrified me as a child, and apparently I wasn't the only one. Supposedly, when the film was shown in a very particular New York theater, the venue had to reupholster the seats because small children would urinate themselves when the witch was on screen. And as an adult, the scenes are still terrifying. When she's the queen, the character's eyes are piercing and intense as she alternates between these squinted glares and wide-eyed mania. Her eyebrows are long, thin, arched, and express an angry hatred that reminded me of my, oh God, the Evil Queen is my mother. The queen's tone also transforms from menacingly soft and velvety to cackling and brash, the volume shifting just as dramatically as her vocal range. And both are equally frightening. But what truly terrified me when I was a small child comfort-eating dried Cheerios out of a Tupperware container were the witch's eyes. Those wide eyes that had made brief appearances when she was the queen encompassed her face completely once she decided to let the witch take control. And I think that's one of the reasons the Evil Queen is so frightening. She represents just how far we're willing to go, how far we're willing to change ourselves in order to get what we want. The queen is driven by envy. It's the force behind her cold-blooded behavior, something that is all too relatable for many, especially from a maternal figure. It's that paradox of the mother who is supposed to be unconditionally loving, who instead attempts complete annihilation of her child's entire being that is so unsettling. It's her self-absorption, her obsession with and envy of her daughter that resonates with both our own fear of being like her and belonging to her. The best stories about good and evil, right and wrong, they're always littered with these little nuggets of moral ambiguity. And those are meant to encourage the audience to reflect on the morality they've been driven to share with the protagonist. Morality is not a binary concept, but there are things that are largely agreed upon by society as being reprehensible, immoral, and unjust. Sometimes, a villain can open our perception to the idea that the hero, whose actions we've not bothered to question up to this point, are in contradiction of what's considered to be moral or just by the rest of society. This leads us to wonder if we ourselves are on the good side. We may wonder if there is a good side. What do we do if each side is fundamentally corrupt? Are we okay aligning ourselves with the lesser of two evils? And should those be our only two choices? Some of us decide that even if they are flawed, the hero may be the best alternative, and we side with them unquestionably. Some of us will take heroes to task for being the de facto arbiter of what they perceive as justice while being riddled with systemic issues themselves. Still, some of us will decide we enjoy the sales pitch of the antagonist and begin to root for whoever is being perceived as the bad guy. And then there are some of us who will see that society's problems aren't being addressed, that things aren't getting any better, and that maybe there's another way forward. These are the people who decide that they are fed up with the status quo and opt to change everything. This is the origin story of both the hero and the villain. Many stories from our childhood were about those heroes that came from backgrounds that included wealth and nobility. Heroes were people who were born special and had special abilities. And if they weren't, they were at some point fortunate enough to be chosen for greatness by an arbitrary power. This was all unrelatable to me. But what was relatable was the conviction and passion from someone who had good intentions, even if they engaged in ethically questionable actions at best. This first became apparent to me while watching Batman. I couldn't help but get where characters like Poison Ivy were coming from. Poison Ivy wasn't interested in money or power. She was only interested in preserving plant life and enacting vengeance on anyone who had harmed those plants. As a child, I didn't really consider Poison Ivy one of the bad guys, and I insisted on dressing up as her for Halloween, something my parents weren't concerned about until I started casually throwing around words like eco-terrorist in a complimentary fashion. Even now, my creative partner is still slightly uncomfortable when I talk about Poison Ivy.
Well, I'm not on board at all because she's killing people because she likes plants. You ever seen those vines that creep out? Does that not give you some evil energy? Like, is that not evil shit? Is that not something evil people do?
I have to believe that this was the experience of a lot of people who grew up with these kinds of compelling and morally ambiguous narratives. As people begin to see things like resource scarcity, mass sickness, rampant violence, and rising tensions between the powers that be, a solution seems to be farther and farther away. That sentiment of dissonance against the established rule of order only continues to grow louder, causing some to side with anyone who might promise answers, even if that person is someone who most of society would clearly see as a wretch in desperate need of rehabilitation. That is the absolutely terrifying promise of a villain, and what it reflects about the fear inside of us all. In order to find out why villains have been depicted the way they have throughout American media history, we have to examine the people who have facilitated the creation of these villains, and what aesthetics and ideologies would be traditionally depicted as heroic, versus which would be presented as less favorable. In other words, the villain may not always be bad, and the hero may not always be good. A story about morality is going to look very different when being told by someone who has experienced adversity because of something like their ethnicity, sexuality, or religion. Perspective is a powerful creative tool when attempting to weave a narrative, and when you as an audience member open yourself up to the perspective of others, you'll find a greater ability to empathize and better understand what might have seemed like a dubious moral standing at first. Diversity of perspective is important, not just for understanding why a villain might be a villain, but when a hero might be a villain, or when a villain might have a point. Throughout the history of movies and television, the people creating these stories in the mainstream were not always the most diverse. The companies that funded these screen projects were attempting to sell their adaptations all across the United States and in some cases internationally. That unfortunately meant pandering to their already established audiences, which often meant that these stories would almost always be told from a very reducted and homogenous viewpoint. This narrowed the concept of what could be perceived as heroic. So, heroism became stoic, masculine, jingoistic, patriarchal, and very, very straight. While villainy was depicted as anything flashy, feminine, and anti-authority. So much so that anyone who didn't feel represented by the media's idea of heroism was left wondering if they were somehow evil because they did not express the values of the archetypical hero. The bad guy became counterculture, and it became cool to rebel against the status quo. The iconic villain suddenly had just as much fandom as their counterpart because the media's idea of what qualified as villainy was more akin to what represented anyone who didn't fit the default.
Today's modern villain isn't pure evil. They're complicated. They have backstories which give context as to why they feel justified in their actions. Even if we don't agree with the means to their end, we often find that we understand where they're coming from. We often find an unexpected empathy for them. We can even see our imperfections reflected in them. And this experience can allow us to contend with, and possibly even understand, our own darker impulses.
Thank you so much for watching me jump into the deep end with this long-form content. If you stuck around, that really does mean the world to me. I want to do more of these kinds of videos, and I can't wait to share them with you. If that's something you're into, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. If you feel like it, no pressure. Special thanks to TawnyVoice.com members and Instagram subscribers. Brisky Business, Link Curie, Jordan, Randy Andrews, Le Phantom Last of His Name Herald of the 4-Day Workweek, Chuck, Joe, Patrick Golden, Sed, Ash, Mike Tatuli, Beowulf042, Ben, and Danny Lamb. This wouldn't be possible without you, and I appreciate you so much. See you next time.